She had always been underestimated, dismissed as delicate and naive, but the moment she walked out of the lavish apartment they once shared, leaving him with nothing but his arrogance and shattered pride, she felt a surge of liberation so intoxicating it nearly made her forget the years of subtle manipulation and control. He had wielded over every dollar, every choice, every heartbeat of her life, and as she drove away from the skyline of Manhattan, her mind was already calculating, planning, envisioning a life where she didn't just survive but thrived. And before I dive deeper, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment to share your thoughts, because you want to miss what happens next. She moved into a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, taking up a position at a marketing firm that, on the surface, seemed ordinary but offered her the perfect camouflage, because she knew that rebuilding wasn't enough. She needed to watch him fail, to let the universe mirror the humiliation he had so effortlessly inflicted on others, and she started with small, deliberate steps. She reopened old accounts in her name, quietly audited investments she had once been forbidden to touch, learned the nuances of real estate, stocks, and business law in the dead of night, all while maintaining a calm smile masking the storm inside. And it was during these long nights of research and strategy that she met Julian, a sharp, slightly mysterious entrepreneur who recognized her intelligence and offered insights into ventures most would consider too risky. Yet she could see potential not just in money but in leverage, influence, and timing, because revenge wasn't just personal, it was art. And she was crafting a masterpiece, all while attending networking events in tailored dresses that turned heads not for vanity but for the impression of stability and grace, leaving him in the past, completely unaware that his former partner, the woman he had casually dismissed as fragile, was now laying the groundwork for a slow, inevitable undoing, a subtle infiltration into his world, starting with his investments and expanding into connections he thought were untouchable. And as months passed, she observed him through social media, industry reports, and mutual contacts, noticing the arrogance that never left him, the overconfidence that made him careless, and she smiled quietly, because she had identified the weakness she could exploit, and she began to subtly influence deals that he relied upon, planting seeds of doubt, arranging coincidences, and nudging partners toward decisions that appeared organic but were all orchestrated by her unseen hand, while outwardly her life appeared calm, her career steady, her social circle expanding, all giving her perfect camouflage, until one evening, after a late meeting, she found herself at an exclusive gallery opening where a major art investor was present, someone who had once been a key player in her ex's first startup. And, with the soft clink of wine glasses and low hum of conversation, she casually mentioned her interest in investing in a new, undiscovered project, capturing his curiosity without revealing the depth of her knowledge. And that evening marked the first subtle crack in his armor, because he overheard her mention of certain market trends he hadn't anticipated, and though he didn't know it yet, the very ideas she planted would later influence decisions that appeared to be his brilliance but in reality were carefully calculated moves on her chessboard. And as winter descended, she orchestrated her first tangible act of indirect revenge. She advised a mutual contact, a financial analyst who once trusted him implicitly, to reconsider a partnership, using only half-truths and strategic phrasing to make it seem like a logical business decision. And the partnership collapsed just enough to bruise his confidence without raising suspicion. And she relished the quiet satisfaction of seeing him scramble, unaware that the woman he had dismissed was now the unseen architect of his growing troubles. And in the meantime, she didn't stop living. She explored new hobbies, traveled to art fairs, and continued expanding her professional network, cultivating a reputation for intelligence and foresight, all while carefully documenting his missteps and patterns, creating a dossier that would one day serve as undeniable proof of how easily he was manipulated. When stripped of his financial comfort, and in her personal life, she allowed herself small joys: a latte at the cafe on Fifth Avenue, a walk in Central Park with Julian, evenings spent reading financial reports instead of gossip magazines, because patience was the key, and revenge required precision, not rashness. And as spring arrived, she noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor at industry events, a slight hesitation in his voice when discussing new ventures, a forced confidence that was just a little too loud, signaling that her initial moves had the desired effect. And she smiled to herself, because she knew that the best revenge isn't explosive or immediate. It's methodical, quiet, and leaves no doubt in the end. And now, armed with knowledge, strategy, and patience, she was ready to escalate, to move from small bruises to substantial setbacks, but every step had to appear accidental, natural, and she was a master at making her fingerprints invisible. And as she prepared for her next move, she recalled the day she left him, the cold wind biting her face as she drove past his building. The sense of freedom mingled with resolve, and she realized that this wasn't just about money or credit, was about proving to herself that she could rise above manipulation, cruelty, and underestimation, transforming every slight, every insult, every moment of being treated as powerless into fuel for the coming storm. And by the time summer arrived, her plan had matured enough to involve a direct professional entanglement, a seemingly casual investment in a tech startup that he had shown interest in. Under the radar, her name carefully hidden behind layers of LLCs and proxies, and as the board discussions began, she subtly influenced decisions that appeared aligned with mutual benefit but were actually engineered to compromise his control. All while Julian provided guidance that was crucial yet never traceable, and she felt an intoxicating thrill at the precision of it all, because no one suspected the quiet woman who once seemed fragile could orchestrate such a complex web of influence, and she knew that patience was paying off. His arrogance would now work against him, and she would be there to collect the results, not with malice alone but with a sense of poetic justice, because she had turned every form of oppression he wielded against her into leverage, and each victory, no matter how small, reinforced her confidence, while outwardly she remained the polite, composed, intelligent woman everyone admired. And even as she smiled during social events, shook hands, and exchanged business cards, her mind was already calculating the next stage, the deeper cut, the point where he would finally realize, too late, that the woman he had taken for granted had become the architect of his unraveling, and that realization would be his downfall, her triumph, and she relished the idea of watching it unfold while maintaining the unassailable appearance of normalcy, because the ultimate revenge is always invisible until it strikes. And with that, she leaned back in her chair at the cafe where she spent hours planning, her laptop open with spreadsheets, contact lists, and timelines, a faint smile playing on her lips as she imagined the dominoes falling one by one, while she sipped her coffee, patient, composed, unstoppable. As summer stretched into a sultry August, she watched him from a distance, carefully noting every detail of his behavior. The way he smiled too broadly at investors, the subtle twitch in his hand when a deal didn't go exactly as planned, because she knew arrogance often blinded the clever, and he had plenty of it. The same arrogance that once made him dismiss her opinions, her ideas, her very presence as inconsequential, and she allowed herself a quiet satisfaction in knowing that every underestimated move she made now was slowly unraveling the empire he thought invincible. She began attending tech conferences, subtly embedding herself into circles he frequented, using her charm and knowledge to gather insider insights that would later tip deals in her favor, all while maintaining a perfectly curated image of independence, elegance, and competence, the kind that made people trust her without suspicion. And every time she walked into a room, she carried an invisible aura of power, the kind that didn't need to shout but could bend situations to her will without leaving a trace. Because true revenge wasn't loud, it was meticulous and invisible, a shadow that slipped past defenses unnoticed. And in those months, she identified several critical vulnerabilities in his latest venture, a risky tech startup promising revolutionary AI integration but riddled with mismanagement and overconfidence. And she quietly positioned herself and Julian to influence the company from the sidelines, using seemingly innocent suggestions, casual conversations at industry mixers, and subtle financial pressure applied through mutual contacts, all while appearing entirely neutral, entirely uninterested, because a predator who reveals itself too early loses its advantage, and she had learned that lesson well during the years of control and manipulation he had inflicted on her. The way he made her question her decisions, doubt her instincts, and depend on his approval for even the smallest of financial choices, a humiliation she had carried in silence for far too long but now converted into fuel for an unstoppable force. And every night, after meticulous planning sessions, she allowed herself small celebrations, a glass of wine on the terrace overlooking Brooklyn, a text message from Julian with a congratulatory note for a particularly well-executed maneuver, a quiet smirk when she saw a subtle ripple of uncertainty appear in his social media posts, all tiny victories that foretold a much larger collapse, and she knew timing was everything because rushing would ruin the precision she had so carefully cultivated. And patience, she reminded herself, was the secret weapon that separated amateurs from masters, and her revenge was not impulsive. It was an art form, and she intended to execute it with the grace and inevitability of a master painter finishing a masterpiece. Each stroke deliberate, each choice irrevocable, yet invisible to anyone who didn't look closely enough, and she continued to cultivate alliances with people he trusted, planting seeds of doubt without ever revealing her hand. A subtle phrase here, a casual warning there, nudging investors and board members toward decisions that appeared organic but were all part of her grand design. And it was exhilarating to see the cracks forming in his empire, tiny at first, almost imperceptible, but enough to create hesitation, uncertainty, and eventually, panic. Because confidence is the lifeblood of a mogul, and she was learning how to cut off his supply without touching a single dollar of his holdings. And as the weeks passed, she orchestrated a small public accident for the startup. A report leaking to the press, carefully edited to highlight minor technical flaws, misrepresented slightly to sound like systemic issues. A story that made investors pause, and the subtle panic it created sent him into frantic meetings, forcing him to reveal stress and indecision to key partners, all documented quietly by her. A dossier, growing into an undeniable record of his unraveling, and she allowed herself a private thrill every time she imagined the moment he would realize just how deep she had infiltrated his life, how carefully she had orchestrated events while appearing innocent, aloof, and above it all. Because the ultimate revenge is not only visible to the perpetrator when it hits, but also perfectly clean, leaving no fingerprints that could trace back to the architect. And she ensured that every move had multiple layers of plausibility, so even the sharpest observer would see nothing unusual, just coincidences, chance, and the consequences of overconfidence, all while she continued her public life with poise, attending art galleries, charity events, and networking dinners where she gained the trust of potential allies and the admiration of strangers who only saw intelligence, grace, and impeccable timing, not the cold precision of a mind plotting the eventual downfall of a man who had once held power over her very existence. And she began collecting physical evidence, subtle yet indisputable, emails, transaction notes, meeting schedules, all revealing the overreach, mistakes, and arrogance that had been his undoing from the beginning, all stored securely in an encrypted cloud accessible only to her, while she maintained the illusion of a normal life, smiling at baristas, waving to neighbors, enjoying late-night walks along the Brooklyn waterfront, all the while mentally cataloging his every misstep, every miscalculation, every overconfidence that would soon come crashing down. And as September arrived, she was ready for the next phase, to touch him financially, not directly, but in ways so cleverly masked that even his closest advisors would think it a coincidence, a ripple effect of minor errors and misjudgments, nothing pointing to her involvement, but all converging to create a perfect storm of loss, frustration, and humiliation. And she began with the key investors he relied upon, leveraging her subtle influence, insider insights, and charm to redirect their attention to slightly more secure ventures, projects that appeared lucrative but were designed to siphon confidence and capital away from his hands. And she watched quietly as his empire wavered, minor tremors that signaled the beginning of a larger collapse, a collapse he would blame on luck, competition, or bad timing, unaware that the orchestrator of his downfall had been right beside him all along, invisible, patient, precise, and relentless. And she allowed herself brief, almost indulgent fantasies of the day he would finally notice the pattern, when he would realize that the woman he dismissed, the woman he left penniless, had risen not only above him but over him, orchestrating his unraveling while maintaining a perfect exterior, calm and untouchable. And those fantasies were tempered by meticulous planning, because she understood that emotion could ruin even the most brilliant revenge if not balanced with cold logic. And so she spent her nights crafting multiple contingencies, preparing for his attempts to counteract, anticipating his moves with the precision of a chess master 3 steps ahead. And as autumn arrived, she positioned herself for the first direct professional encounter, an industry gala where he would present the very startup she had been quietly undermining. And she made sure to attend with Julian, appearing as a supportive peer, complimenting his presentations in public forums, all while privately setting the stage for the final blows that would dismantle his confidence, partnerships, and financial leverage. And every detail was considered: lighting, seating, introductions, casual remarks, overheard by influential attendees, all designed to make him appear overconfident, out of touch, and subtly failing, while she remained composed, intelligent, admired, and untouchable. And she knew that when the moment came, he would have no clue, no suspicion. Only the gradual realization that every decision he made, every deal he orchestrated, every partnership he valued, had been quietly influenced by the woman he had scorned, underestimated, and dismissed. And that realization would be the sweetest, most satisfying revenge of all. And as she left the gala that night, stepping into the crisp autumn air, she allowed herself a small, private smile, knowing the plan was unfolding perfectly, because she had spent months building influence, planting seeds, exploiting weaknesses, and now, the first public tremors of his downfall were beginning to ripple outward, and she would ensure they became a tsunami, not with violence, not with drama, but with patience, precision, and invisible genius. And she understood that the ultimate satisfaction would come not from watching him suffer in public, but from knowing that every move he made from now on would be shadowed by her influence, whether he realized it or not, a puppet to the quiet, brilliant architect he never suspected existed. And as she walked home, the lights of the city shimmering on the East River, she reflected on the long path that had brought her here from Penniless, dismissed and controlled to patient, meticulous, and unstoppably. She knew the next months would see him falter further, every misstep amplified by the subtle hands she had planted in his world, every decision nudged by her quiet genius, until the day came when he would finally see the full extent of what had been orchestrated behind his back. And that day would mark the pinnacle of her triumphs, the moment her years of patience, intelligence, and precision paid off. And she allowed herself a final, lingering sip of coffee as the wind whispered along the water, a reminder that she had chosen silence, precision, and invisibility as her weapons, and that by the time he realized the truth, it would already be too late. The empire he thought secure crumbling in ways he never could have anticipated, all because she had mastered the art of quiet, unstoppable, perfect revenge. By the time October arrived, the subtle tremors she had orchestrated in his professional life were growing into undeniable ripples of instability, and she watched with quiet satisfaction as his confidence, once a towering edifice of arrogance, began to crack under the weight of decisions subtly influenced by her unseen hand. Because patience had paid off, and now the consequences of his overconfidence were unfolding exactly as she had anticipated. She attended yet another gala, this time a high-profile tech and finance summit in Midtown, where his latest startup would be lauded by the press, and she moved through the crowd with her usual grace, Julian at her side, engaging in casual conversations that concealed strategic reconnaissance, noting who still held loyalty to him, who had doubts, and who could be nudged ever so slightly toward decisions that would further destabilize his empire. Because revenge, she reminded herself, was not about spectacle but precision, and the more carefully she orchestrated each move, the more powerful and irreversible the outcome would be. And as he took the stage to present a new AI initiative, she observed him through a crowd, noting the micro-expressions of uncertainty that only someone paying attention could see through the tightened jaw. The slight hesitation before answering questions, the involuntary glance toward his aides for reassurance, all small cracks that validated her plan. And that night, she subtly planted an idea in a conversation with a key investor. She mentioned a competing tech solution in a casual, almost offhand way, highlighting its efficiency and growth potential, never implying that he should change his strategy, just letting the seed of doubt germinate. And within days, that seed had grown into whispered concerns that began circulating among board members and investors, a ripple effect that left him scrambling to reassure, overextend, and make hasty decisions. And she observed all of it quietly, taking meticulous notes in her private journals, documenting each move, each misstep, each subtle fracture of his previously unshakable confidence, while outwardly maintaining the image of an intelligent, independent woman thriving in her career, admired by peers, and trusted by contacts, because invisibility was her greatest weapon, and the more public his missteps became, the more invisible she remained, quietly relishing the growing tension. And as Halloween approached, she prepared her next move, an indirect financial maneuver that would strike at the heart of his new venture, executed so subtly that no one, not even his closest advisors, would suspect the orchestration behind it, because true revenge leaves no fingerprints, and she had mastered the art of remaining untouchable while pulling the strings, a skill honed over months of careful observation, precise planning, and patient execution. And she coordinated with Julian to arrange a meeting with a prominent venture capital firm, positioning herself as a potential ally and silent influence, all while ensuring her name never appeared directly in any official documentation, allowing her influence to flow like water through channels only she could see and control. And over the following weeks, small failures began to appear. A delayed shipment here, a miscommunication there, a contract clause misinterpreted by a junior associate, all seemingly innocent, all perfectly timed, and she watched as his frustration grew, the facade of control beginning to crumble, because he was no longer the master of the environment he once dominated, and the invisible hand guiding these outcomes was hers alone. And she allowed herself a private smile as she imagined the day he would finally notice the pattern, when he would realize that every misstep, every error, every failure he attributed to chance or incompetence had actually been carefully orchestrated by the very woman he had once dismissed as powerless, a revelation that would leave him reeling, humiliated, and utterly powerless, because she understood that the sweetest revenge is the one that leaves the perpetrator fully aware of their own helplessness. And she continued her work quietly. Late-night strategy sessions with Julian, careful analysis of every board meeting transcript she could access, subtle manipulations of investor perceptions, and calculated public appearances designed to make her seem competent, independent, and above the fray, all while ensuring that he remained blind to her involvement. And in her personal life, she allowed herself small indulgences, dinners at boutique restaurants, weekends at art galleries, walks along the Brooklyn waterfront, but always with one eye on the unfolding plan. Because a true architect of revenge never rests, never becomes complacent, and every distraction must serve a purpose or remain under control. And by mid-November, she executed her next masterstroke, an indirect competitive investment, strategically acquiring stakes in a rival tech project that promised similar AI capabilities, positioning it so that his own investors would see potential in the competitor, generating whispers of uncertainty, comparisons, all seemingly natural, organic, yet entirely orchestrated by her careful planning. And she marveled at the elegance of the design, because she had created a web of influence, so subtle that he could not identify the source, only the consequences, and the consequences were growing, visible to all, undeniable in their impact, but invisible in origin, which was the hallmark of perfect revenge. And as Thanksgiving approached, she found herself reflecting on the journey, from powerless, controlled, and dismissed, to patient, methodical, brilliant, and unstoppable, because every insult, every humiliation, every moment of manipulation he had inflicted on her had been transmuted into strategy, insight, and power. And she understood that revenge is never about anger, but about intelligence, precision, and timing, and she had cultivated all three in abundance, while he remained oblivious, trusting the wrong people, overestimating his control, and underestimating her influence, because arrogance is a flaw easily exploited by a mind disciplined, patient, and visionary. And she watched him falter further, partnerships questioned, investor confidence wavered, public perception subtly shifting, all orchestrated without a single trace of malice exposed, all perfectly hidden behind the guise of coincidence and chance. And she allowed herself a small thrill, savoring the moment, knowing that the final stages of her plan were approaching, where indirect influence would transform into direct consequence, where the invisible hand would finally be revealed. And the man who once controlled her life, her choices, and her every resource would discover, far too late, the full extent of her power, brilliance, and patience. And she spent the nights preparing for that moment, crafting communications, plotting boardroom maneuvers, and ensuring that every decision point he faced would be subtly guided by her careful orchestration, so that even his attempts at control would further the unraveling she had meticulously designed. And she understood that the most powerful revenge is not merely punitive but transformational. It teaches, exposes, and reshapes the world around the perpetrator in a way that is undeniable, inevitable, and irreversible. And she had mastered this art, each step executed with precision, timing, and invisible mastery. And she looked forward to the day he would finally see the pattern, the thread connecting every misstep, every error, every moment of doubt and failure, back to her. And she would remain composed, untouchable, and utterly triumphant, because true revenge is not a moment but a journey, and hers had been long, patient, methodical, and now approaching its apex, where every calculated step, every subtle influence, and every moment of strategic invisibility would converge to reveal a masterpiece of retribution so complete, so irreversible, that he would have no defense, no escape, and no understanding of how the woman he had dismissed had become the architect of his ultimate downfall. and she allowed herself a quiet smile, sipping her coffee at a late-night cafe, watching the city lights dance across the East River, knowing that the storm she had cultivated over months was about to break, and when it did, it would be total, precise, and unforgettable, a testament to patience, brilliance, and the quiet, unstoppable power of a woman who refused to be powerless ever again. As the first snow dusted the rooftops of Manhattan, she watched the effects of her meticulous orchestration begin to manifest in ways far more dramatic than mere boardroom tremors. His once impeccable reputation, carefully curated over years of charm and calculated networking, began to show cracks that were impossible to ignore, and she observed it all with a quiet, almost clinical satisfaction. Because months of invisible manipulation were finally producing visible chaos, and the man who had once controlled her entire existence was now scrambling desperately to regain footing, unaware that every misstep he blamed on competition, market fluctuations, or unfortunate timing had been planted and nurtured by the very woman he had dismissed as powerless, a woman whose patience, intelligence, and resolve now outmatched his arrogance and impulsiveness, and she had carefully ensured that each event unfolded with absolute plausibility, so that no one could suspect the precision behind the unraveling, leaving him bewildered, anxious, and increasingly isolated. While she moved through her own life with the calm certainty of someone who held all the keys, her image of poise and competence only reinforcing the contrast between his crumbling world and her controlled ascendancy. And, as December approached, she executed the most critical moves of her plan: strategic public announcements of investments in rival tech ventures, casual interactions with influential media figures who began covering his startup with subtle skepticism, and the quiet but decisive redirection of key investors toward projects that promised less risk, all calculated to erode both his financial control and his psychological stability. And she watched with a faint smile as minor errors in his operations, previously invisible, now gained attention, undermining confidence among board members and partners who had once been loyal without question, while he doubled down on effort, driven by panic rather than reason, unknowingly executing decisions that furthered the very unraveling she had designed. And she allowed herself to relish the brilliance of the strategy, because the ultimate revenge isn't just in visible defeat but in the psychological inevitability of collapse, the realization that control once taken for granted has been systematically dismantled without overt confrontation. And she spent hours quietly preparing each next step, analyzing financial statements, monitoring investor sentiment, and crafting scenarios where his attempts at recovery would inadvertently accelerate his downfall, all while maintaining the serene facade of a woman thriving professionally, socially, and emotionally, appearing calm, composed, and untouchable in public spaces, where he was increasingly conspicuous for all the wrong reasons. And as the winter holidays approached, she engineered a series of critical meetings that would leave him overextended, exposed, and scrambling, designing each encounter so that minor errors would appear amplified, partners' doubts would become vocal, and his once commanding presence would now inspire hesitation rather than confidence. And she observed every moment with precise attention, noting how the subtle pressures she applied, the seeds of doubt she planted months prior, and the carefully timed interventions of her allies combined to create cascading consequences that left him with almost no options. And the most satisfying aspect was that he would never trace the chain back to her. Every link appeared organic, coincidental, or the result of his own mismanagement, and she understood that this invisible architecture of influence was the most profound form of triumph, because the realization of the architect's presence, only when the damage is done, leaves a lasting impression, one of humiliation, awe, and helplessness. And she continued to expand her influence subtly, attending social gatherings where he might be present, casually sharing insights with mutual contacts, strategically congratulating partners he relied upon, and planting seeds of comparison between his startup and the competitor she had quietly nurtured, all while maintaining an unassailable image of independence and intelligence. And every day she watched the psychological toll on him: visible stress, overcompensation in public, minor conflicts with colleagues, sleepless nights evident in social media snapshots, and casual mentions of delays and setbacks in interviews, all pointing toward a domino effect she had perfectly orchestrated. And she allowed herself a brief moment of private satisfaction, remembering the day she left him, powerless and constrained, and marveling at how far she had come, from a life dictated by his control to one where she not only reclaimed freedom but wielded influence. more profound than his arrogance had ever imagined, and she smiled quietly, sipping coffee in her Brooklyn apartment, knowing that the final moves of her plan were imminent, the stage set for the ultimate convergence of strategy, influence, and inevitability, because true revenge is not a single strike but a sequence of calculated actions leading to an irreversible outcome. And she had spent months ensuring that every variable was accounted for, every contingency planned, every ally positioned, and every outcome anticipated, so that when the final moment arrived, it would be flawless, absolute, and devastating. And she began her final maneuvers, leveraging last-minute investor hesitations, strategically timed press releases questioning leadership choices in his company, subtly spreading rumors of a potential acquisition that would destabilize confidence further, and orchestrating private discussions that would leave him questioning every decision he had made, all while maintaining the public perception of neutrality and professionalism, appearing almost charitable in her interactions, a stark contrast to the chaos she engineered from behind the scenes, and she allowed herself a small thrill in knowing that the web she had woven, invisible and intricate, was tightening, and soon, very soon, it would collapse precisely as she intended, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his own decisions, miscalculations, and underestimated brilliance of the woman he had once dismissed. And, as Christmas approached, she attended the final networking event of the season, a gala where he was to announce the next stage of his AI venture, and she observed him from across the room, noting the visible tension in his stance, the forced confidence in his smile, the slight hesitations in responses, all confirming that her influence had reached its apex. And in those moments, she realized the depth of satisfaction revenge can bring when executed with patience, precision, and intelligence. It's not about public spectacle, shouting, or confrontation. It's about invisible dominance, subtle orchestration, and the quiet triumph of watching a man's carefully constructed empire crumble from within while he remains oblivious. And as the gala drew to a close, she knew that within days, the cumulative effects of her meticulous orchestration, the investor withdrawals, the internal doubts, the public scrutiny, the competitor's rising prominence would reach a tipping point, and he would finally recognize that the woman he had left penniless, underestimated, and dismissed had become the mastermind behind his undoing, and in that realization, she would find the ultimate satisfaction, because it would not be his ruin alone, but the undeniable proof that patience, intelligence, and precision can overcome arrogance, control, and cruelty. And she left the gala that night with Julian, the city lights reflecting off the snow-covered streets, her mind already anticipating the final stage, the moment of revelation, the culmination of months of invisible planning. And she smiled quietly, knowing the storm she had cultivated was about to break, and when it did, it would be absolute, perfect, and irreversible. Winter had fully settled over Manhattan, a crisp silence in the streets reflecting the tension that had built relentlessly over months, and she knew that the moment she had patiently orchestrated, meticulously planned, and silently executed was finally at hand. The subtle cracks that had appeared in his empire were now widening into gaping chasms, and she watched with quiet, controlled satisfaction as his carefully curated world began to crumble, because the man who had once controlled her every choice, dictated her every move, and left her penniless, was now powerless in ways that were undeniable, irreversible, and entirely of his own making. And she had orchestrated it so flawlessly that no one could pinpoint the origin, attributing the collapse to market forces, competition, or overconfidence, yet every domino had fallen exactly according to the strategy she had laid months ago. And as she attended the board meeting in an elegantly understated outfit, Julian at her side, she noted the subtle glances, hesitant gestures, and visible anxiety that had replaced the arrogance he once carried like armor, because the tension in the room was palpable, and she had cultivated it with patience, precision, and invisible influence, guiding investors, partners, and colleagues with whispers, casual advice, and carefully planted doubts that now erupted into open questioning. And he tried desperately to regain control, issuing directives that sounded confident but lacked substance, his team visibly divided, his closest allies quietly exchanging skeptical looks, all while she remained the calm observer, admired by peers, trusted by investors, untouchable. And in that moment, she realized that revenge, executed with intelligence and patience rather than anger, is far more devastating than any impulsive confrontation, because it leaves the target not only defeated but questioning every decision, every trust, every relationship, and ultimately themselves. And she watched as the final pieces fell into place. A key investor withdrew support at the last minute, citing concerns that she had subtly seeded months earlier. A media report surfaced comparing his startup unfavorably to a competitor he had ignored, a competitor she had nurtured and invested in behind layers of proxies, and a contractual misstep, seemingly minor, snowballed into a potential legal challenge that forced him into expensive consultations and distracted him from crucial decision-making. And every time he tried to respond, her careful pre-planning ensured that he was met with obstacles he could not anticipate. Allies who were subtly influenced to question his judgment, and situations that made him appear indecisive and overextended, all without her lifting a finger publicly, all orchestrated invisibly, all flowing from her mind like a carefully directed current. And as the snow continued to fall outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room, she realized that the psychological impact on him was profound. He shifted uncomfortably, defensive responses poorly masked as confidence, body language betraying the realization that the empire he had built was unraveling, and she smiled quietly, because he would never admit it. But the realization that the woman he had dismissed and left penniless had outmaneuvered him at every turn was undeniable, humiliating, and utterly irreversible. And she knew the next few days would see cascading consequences. Investor confidence would waver further. Internal conflicts would escalate. Public perception would shift subtly but noticeably. And competitors would seize on opportunities he was now too distracted to defend, all orchestrated without a single overt attack, without a confrontation, because the most brilliant revenge leaves no fingerprints, only outcomes, and she had mastered this art, having spent months turning every insult, every moment of control, every act of cruelty he inflicted into leverage, intelligence, and power. And she allowed herself a brief reflection, from the moment she walked away, powerless, penniless, and dismissed, to now. She had become the architect of an unstoppable, invisible force, bending events, people, and outcomes to achieve perfect justice. And as she returned home that evening, snow crunching under her boots, she reflected on the elegance of the plan, patient, meticulous, precise, executed without malice but with absolute clarity of purpose, because true revenge is not about anger, it is about intelligence, control, and timing, and she had them in abundance. And over the following week, the final dominoes fell. The board formally questioned his leadership, investors publicly shifted support to the competitor, media coverage highlighted his miscalculations, and his allies quietly distanced themselves, leaving him isolated, scrambling, and forced to acknowledge the unraveling he could neither understand nor control. And throughout it all, she remained serene, composed, untouchable, a vision of intelligence, grace, and calm, all while enjoying the private satisfaction of witnessing the results of her patient, invisible orchestration, knowing that he could never trace the sequence back to her, never anticipate the precision with which she had dismantled everything he had once held dear. And as she sat by her window, city lights reflecting off the snow, she thought of the irony. The man who had once measured her worth in dollars, controlled her life with arrogance, and left her penniless had been undone, not by confrontation, not by public humiliation, but by the quiet, brilliant patience of a woman he underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed. And in the final act of her revenge, she allowed herself a private triumph. She withdrew her indirect influence from the competitor, consolidating her position in a venture he could no longer touch, ensuring her financial independence, her influence, and her unassailable victory. Because her revenge was never just about seeing him fall, it was about reclaiming her power, her freedom, and her life. And as the final legal, financial, and professional obstacles converged, he faced the truth. Every setback, every misstep, every loss he experienced was the result of his own arrogance and the unseen hand of the woman he once sought to control. And she smiled quietly, because she had orchestrated it flawlessly, leaving no evidence, only outcomes. And as the first light of January sunlight touched the Brooklyn skyline, she realized that her journey from powerless, dismissed, and controlled to triumphant, independent, and unstoppable was complete. The perfect revenge executed not in moments of rage but in months of patience, strategy, and subtle brilliance. And she allowed herself a quiet sip of coffee, reflecting on the totality of her triumph, knowing that he would never fully comprehend the depth of her intelligence, the precision of her planning, or the inevitability of his downfall. And that was the ultimate satisfaction. Invisible mastery, undeniable victory, and the knowledge that a life once controlled, dismissed, and constrained had been transformed into one of power, freedom, and perfect, irreversibly executed revenge.